Hidden beneath the floorboards of a recently auctioned Montana ranch lay a secret that defied human decency. Gareth Holt sought only peace and grazing land when he bought the neighboring acreage. Instead, beneath the dust and decaying wood, he unearthed a trembling captive, thrusting him into a deadly frontier war. Gareth Holt was not a man who sought out the company of others. Standing 6'3" with shoulders as broad as a yoke, he was a creature of the high timber, a mountain man who had spent the better part of a decade trapping along the unforgiving ridges of the Bitterroot Range. His face, weathered by freezing winds and scarred by a close encounter with a silver-tipped grizzly, was half hidden beneath a thick, dark beard. He had come down to the valley for one reason: to secure the deed to the neighboring property. The Trent Ranch, a sprawling 200-acre spread adjacent to Gareth's own modest homestead, had gone to the county for unpaid taxes. Its former owner, Josiah Trent, a man with a reputation as sharp and cruel as barbed wire, had simply vanished 3 months prior. Most folks in the settlement of Oakhaven assumed Trent had finally run afoul of the wrong element or skipped town to dodge his mounting debts. When the auctioneer's gavel fell on that crisp October morning in 1888, Gareth handed over a leather pouch heavy with gold dust and walked away with the title. He didn't want Trent's dilapidated house. He merely wanted the Sweetwater Creek that snaked through the property, ensuring his expanding herd of cattle would survive the coming droughts. 2 days later, Gareth rode his heavy draft horse, Buster, over the property line to inspect his new purchase. The wind howled through the canyon, rattling the dry yellow grass. The Trent farmhouse sat in a depression between 2 low hills, its paint peeling like a bad sunburn, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The place felt fundamentally wrong, bathed in an eerie, unnatural silence that made the hair on the back of Gareth's neck stand up. A mountain man survives by trusting his instincts, and every instinct Gareth possessed was screaming that the air in this hollow was poisoned. He dismounted, hitching Buster to a rotting fence post, and unholstered his Colt revolver. He kicked open the front door. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale autumn sunlight, filtering through grimy windows. The house had been ransacked. Drawers were pulled from their dressers. Floorboards were pried up in the corners, and overturned furniture littered the parlor. Someone had been searching for something with desperate, violent intent. Gareth moved through the house with the silent grace of a hunter. The kitchen smelled faintly of rot and stale air. As he stepped near the cast-iron stove, his heavy boot struck something hollow. He paused, frowning. He scraped away a layer of grime and kicked aside a heavy, moth-eaten rug. Beneath it lay a heavy oak trap door, flush with the floorboards, secured by a massive iron padlock and a thick deadbolt. Why would someone bolt a root cellar from the outside? He knelt, examining the heavy lock. It was relatively new, the brass untarnished by the dampness of the house. Grabbing a heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, Gareth wedged the pointed end into the clasp of the padlock. With a grunt that strained the thick muscles of his back and arms, he leveraged his weight against the iron. The metal groaned, then snapped with a sharp crack that echoed loudly in the empty house. Gareth threw the deadbolt and hauled the heavy door open. A foul stench wafted up a mixture of damp earth, human waste, and profound despair. He pulled a box of matches from his coat, struck one against the floorboard, and peered into the pitch-black abyss. "Is someone down there?" His voice rumbled, deep and gravelly, breaking the suffocating silence. A small, terrified gasp answered him. It was a sound so frail and human that it stopped the mountain man's heart. Gareth grabbed a kerosene lantern from the kitchen table, quickly lit it with the dying match, and descended the steep, rotting wooden stairs. The flickering orange light pushed back the darkness, revealing a damp, stone-lined cellar that was no larger than a root storage bin. Huddled in the farthest corner, shielding her eyes from the sudden light, was a woman. She was dangerously thin, her clothes reduced to soiled, torn rags. Her hair, a tangled mess of dull auburn, hung in matted clumps over her pale, dirt-streaked face. But it was her eyes that pierced Gareth wide, striking green eyes dilated with a mixture of feral terror and desperate, agonizing hope. Around her right ankle was a heavy iron cuff, connected to a short, rusted chain bolted directly into the stone foundation. Gareth froze, the breath completely knocked out of his lungs. He had seen the brutality of nature, had fought wolves and outlaws, but the calculated cruelty of this scene turned his stomach to ice. "Please," she croaked, her voice dry and rasping like sandpaper. She scrambled backward until her shoulders hit the cold stone wall, the chain rattling ominously. "Please, don't." "He said he wouldn't come back," he said. "Easy, miss," Gareth said, his voice dropping to the gentlest register he could manage. He slowly lowered the lantern to the dirt floor and raised his empty hands, showing he meant no harm. "I'm not the man who put you here. My name is Gareth. I own this land now, and I'm getting you out of this hole." He approached her with the cautious, deliberate movements one might use to approach a wounded doe. She flinched as he knelt beside her, squeezing her eyes shut, but she didn't fight as he inspected the shackle around her ankle. The iron had rubbed the skin raw and bloody. There was no key. "I'm going to have to break the chain," Gareth told her softly. "It'll be loud. Cover your ears." He drew his Colt, wrapped his thick leather coat around the barrel and the chain link nearest the wall to muffle the blast and catch any shrapnel, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the confined space, but the rusted iron link shattered. The woman stared at her freed leg, chest heaving, unable to process the reality of it. Before she could attempt to stand on her weakened legs, Gareth scooped her up into his massive arms. She weighed practically nothing, a fragile bundle of bones and ragged breath. She instinctively buried her face into his chest, clutching the fabric of his shirt as if letting go would plunge her back into the nightmare. Gareth carried her up the stairs, out of the cursed farmhouse, and into the blinding Montana sunlight. He wrapped her securely in his heavy wool blanket, settled her gently into the saddle of his horse, and climbed up behind her. "You're safe now," Gareth murmured, turning Buster toward the high timber, toward the safety of his cabin. "I swear on my life, nobody is ever locking you in the dark again." For 4 days and 4 nights the wind howled outside Gareth's fortified log cabin, but inside a warm fire crackled endlessly in the stone hearth. Gareth proved to be as tender a nurse as he was a formidable frontiersman. He fed the woman warm broth, bathed her bruised face with clean snowmelt, and gave her his own bed while he slept in a chair by the fire, his rifle resting across his knees. On the 5th morning, the fever that had gripped her finally broke. Gareth was outside chopping firewood when he heard the cabin door creak open. He turned, axe mid-swing, to see her standing in the doorway. She was wrapped in one of his oversized flannel shirts, which fell to her knees like a dress. Cleaned of the grime, the hollows of her cheeks were still pronounced, but the resilience in her green eyes burned brighter than before. "You make a lot of noise for a mountain man," she said, her voice still raspy, but carrying a hint of defiance. Gareth lowered the axe, a rare, faint smile tugging at the corners of his bearded mouth. "Figured the wolves needed to know someone was awake. You shouldn't be out of bed, miss." "I don't even know my savior's full name," she replied, stepping out onto the porch, breathing in the crisp pine air as if tasting a fine wine. "Gareth Holt." "Claire," she said, wrapping her arms around herself against the chill. "Claire Abernathy." Gareth's brow furrowed. The name Abernathy carried weight in the territory. William Abernathy had been a wealthy railroad baron who had originally settled the entire valley, a man of immense power who had reportedly died of cholera 2 years ago in Denver, leaving his massive estate in legal limbo. "Abernathy," Gareth repeated, stepping closer. "Josiah Trent locked an Abernathy in his root cellar?" Claire's expression hardened, the trauma shadowing her features, but her voice remained steady. "Josiah Trent was my father's foreman. When my father fell ill, Josiah forged a will claiming the lower valley for himself. But the master deed, the document that proves the forgery and leaves the entire valley, including the water rights, to me was hidden. My father hid it before he died, and he told only me where it was. Gareth leaned against his chopping block, piecing the puzzle together. Trent ransacked the house looking for it. He tortured me for it, Claire corrected quietly, looking down at her scarred ankle. He kept me in that cellar for 3 months, starved me, threatened me. He wanted me to sign a new deed transferring all rights to him, or tell him where the master document was hidden. I refused. Gareth felt a profound surge of respect for the fragile woman standing before him. To endure that kind of hell in total darkness and still refuse to break required a spine of absolute steel. It was a ruggedness he understood intimately. Why did he leave? Gareth asked. Why abandon the property and let it go to tax auction? He didn't abandon it, Claire said, her eyes meeting Gareth's, wide with sudden urgency. 3 months ago, a U.S. Marshal came around asking questions about my disappearance. Josiah got spooked. He locked me down there, threw the rugs over the trapdoor, and fled to the Dakota Badlands to lay low, expecting his associates to pay the taxes. But they must have failed. He told me he would be back when the heat died down. He told me he would tear the house down board by board if he had to. Gareth absorbed the information, his mind calculating the terrain, the odds, the threat. Who are his associates? The Red River Boys, Claire whispered, naming a notorious gang of cutthroats known for running stolen cattle across the border. Josiah isn't just a rancher, Gareth. He's their leader. Gareth looked out over the valley. From his high vantage point, he could see the miles of rolling plains leading up to his timberline. If Trent was coming back, he would bring men. Heavily armed men who wouldn't hesitate to slaughter a mountain man who had inadvertently bought their stolen prize and rescued their prisoner. "Where is the deed, Claire?" Gareth asked softly. "Hidden inside the stone wall of the cellar," she replied, "behind a loose rock near where the chain was bolted. Josiah was too busy tearing the floorboards apart upstairs to check the very walls of my prison." Gareth nodded slowly. He didn't just buy a piece of land. He had bought the epicenter of a frontier war, and he had unwittingly brought the prime target right into his home. He looked at Claire. The sunlight caught the auburn of her hair. She was looking at him not with the helpless terror of a victim, but with the evaluating gaze of a survivor. In that quiet moment, amidst the towering pines, Gareth felt something shift deep inside his solitary heart. He had spent his whole life avoiding the entanglements of the world, but looking at Claire, he knew he was willing to bleed to protect her. "We need to leave," Claire said, misinterpreting his silence. "If Josiah finds out the ranch was sold, he'll come here. I won't let you die for me, Gareth." "I ain't planning on dying, Claire," Gareth said, walking past her into the cabin and pulling a heavy Winchester repeater from the wall rack. He began checking the action. The metallic clack-clack, a comforting, familiar sound. "And I ain't running off my own land." "You don't understand," Claire pleaded, following him inside. "Josiah is ruthless. He'll have 10 men with him. Then 10 men are going to have a very bad day," Gareth replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to her, his dark eyes fiercely protective. "You are an Abernathy. This valley is yours by right. I am Gareth Holt, and this mountain is mine. I pulled you out of the dark, Claire. I'm not about to let Josiah Trent drag you back into it." He handed her a smaller, silver-plated derringer from his footlocker. "Do you know how to shoot?" Claire took the weapon, her hand remarkably steady. "My father taught me." "Good." Gareth began shoving boxes of ammunition into his coat pockets. "Because a storm is coming, Claire, and we are going to be the ones who break it." Just then, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle echoed up from the valley below. Gareth moved swiftly to the window, peering through the heavy wooden shutters. Down on the switchback trail that led up to his property, a plume of dust was rising. Through his brass spyglass, Gareth spotted them. 8 riders, heavily armed, moving fast. And leading them was a man in a long duster coat, riding a black stallion Josiah Trent had returned. Locked in a pitch-black cellar for months, a wealthy heiress was left to rot by a ruthless outlaw. but he never accounted for the rugged mountain man who bought the land right above her. Prepare for a true tale of frontier survival, intense romance, and explosive Wild West justice. Gun smoke quickly replaced the crisp scent of pine. The first volley of rifle fire from the valley floor tore through the high branches of the evergreens, sending a shower of needles raining down upon Gareth's cabin roof. Josiah Trent and his Red River boys did not bother with the pleasantries of a parley. They had come to tie up loose ends and erase any witnesses to their crimes. They spurred their horses up the narrow switchback trail, howling like coyotes, expecting the new landowner to cower in the face of overwhelming numbers. They grossly miscalculated the nature of their prey. Gareth Holt had spent years surviving in territory where a single mistake meant death. He knew every blind corner, every rocky outcropping, and every shadow on Timber Ridge. He shoved Claire gently behind the thick stone mass of the fireplace. "Keep your head down and reload for me," Gareth instructed, his voice eerily calm despite the lead thudding against the heavy log walls. He handed her a burlap sack heavy with brass cartridges. Stepping to a narrow firing port he had carved into the window shutter, Gareth leveled his Winchester. He didn't fire rapidly. Mountain men did not waste lead. He waited until the lead rider crested a steep incline, silhouetted against the bright blue Montana sky. Gareth exhaled slowly, letting the air empty from his lungs, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The lead rider was thrown backward out of his saddle, tumbling down the dusty embankment. The remaining 7 riders scattered instantly, diving from their horses and taking cover behind the massive trunks of the ponderosa pines. "Holt!" a voice bellowed from the tree line. It was a vicious, grating sound that made Claire physically flinch. "Josiah Trent, we don't have a quarrel with you, mountain man. Send the girl out, and we'll ride away. You can keep the lower pasture." Gareth racked the lever of his Winchester, the hot brass casing ejecting and clinking against the floorboards. "I own this land, Trent. All of it. And the lady is under my protection." "You're a fool dying for a ghost," Trent shouted back. A fresh barrage of gunfire erupted, splintering the heavy wooden door of the cabin. Claire's hands trembled, but her focus remained absolute as she slotted fresh cartridges into Gareth's spare rifle. She crawled across the floor, handing the loaded weapon up to him and taking the empty one. As she did, she risked a glance through a lower crack in the logs. Through the drifting smoke, she saw a man moving stealthily along the eastern flank of the cabin, trying to find an angle on the rear door. He wasn't dressed like the other rough-hewn outlaws. He wore a tailored suit, albeit covered in trail dust, and a bowler hat. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from a profound, sickening shock. "Caleb?" she whispered. Gareth glanced down at her, his eyes narrowed. "You know him?" "That's Caleb Mercer," Claire said, her voice shaking with revelation. "He was my father's chief accountant. He was the one who managed the estate after my father died. He was the one who told me Josiah was handling the legal disputes." The pieces fell into place with devastating clarity. Josiah Trent hadn't acted alone. He was merely the muscle. The brains behind the theft of the Abernathy fortune was the man her father had trusted most with their ledgers. Caleb Mercer had orchestrated the forged will, employing Trent to eliminate the only legitimate heir. "Mercer is trying to flank us," Gareth noted, shifting his aim. But before he could fire, 2 of Trent's men provided covering fire, forcing Gareth to duck as bullets chewed through the window frame, showering him in sharp splinters. One jagged piece of wood sliced across Gareth's cheek, drawing a thick red line down into his beard. Claire didn't hesitate. Seeing Gareth bleed ignited a fierce, protective fury inside her that entirely eclipsed her terror. She raised the silver-plated derringer Gareth had given her, rested the barrel through a gap in the chinking of the logs, and aimed at the creeping accountant. She pulled the trigger. The small gun cracked sharply. Caleb Mercer shrieked, clutching his shoulder as the bullet tore through his tailored jacket. He stumbled backward, abandoning his flanking maneuver and scrambling desperately behind a cluster of boulders. Gareth looked at Claire, genuine astonishment flashing in his dark eyes, followed quickly by a look of deep, abiding admiration. "Nice shot, heiress." Claire managed a breathless, adrenaline-fueled smile. "I told you, my father taught me." Outside, Josiah Trent realized his siege was failing. The element of surprise was gone. He was losing men, and the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Every hour they spent pinned down by the mountain man was an hour closer to drawing unwanted attention from the nearest settlement. "Fall back!" Trent roared, his voice tinged with panic and rage. "Forget the cabin! We ride for the valley! Burn the farmhouse to the ground! Burn the deed with it!" Gareth's blood ran cold. If Trent burned the Trent ranch, the master deed hidden in the cellar walls would be reduced to ash. Claire would have no legal claim to her father's empire. Caleb Mercer would legalize the forged documents, and Trent would own the very land they stood on. "They're retreating," Gareth said, grabbing his heavy canvas coat and shoving extra ammunition into his pockets. He turned to Claire, his expression intensely serious. "If they burn that house, you lose everything." "I don't care about the money, Gareth," Claire said, grabbing his arm. "I care about stopping them. I care about making sure they never lock another living soul in the dark." Gareth nodded, a silent promise passing between them. He kicked open the rear door of the cabin. "Then we ride." Buster, Gareth's massive draft horse, was built for power, not speed, but the beast possessed a mountain-bred sure-footedness that Trent's lowland horses lacked. Gareth and Claire rode double, crashing down the steep, treacherous hunting trails that bypassed the winding switchbacks. Branches whipped at their clothes, and the steep decline threatened to throw them over the horse's neck. But Claire clung tightly to Gareth's waist, burying her face against his broad back. They reached the valley floor just as the sky turned the color of bruised plums. Plumes of thick black smoke were already rising from the depression between the hills. Josiah Trent and his remaining 3 men had beaten them there. They were systematically tossing kerosene lanterns through the broken windows of the old farmhouse. Flames licked greedily at the dry, peeling wood of the porch. Gareth brought Buster to a sliding halt behind a dilapidated barn 50 yards from the main house. He dismounted smoothly, lifting Claire down beside him. "The deed is in the cellar," Claire urged, coughing as the acrid smoke drifted over them. "Behind the loose stone on the north wall." "You stay here," Gareth commanded, drawing his Colt. "I'll get it." "No," Claire said, her voice brokering no argument. "You don't know which stone, and I am not hiding in the shadows ever again." Before Gareth could stop her, she bolted from the cover of the barn, sprinting toward the burning house. Gareth swore under his breath and sprinted after her, his long strides eating up the distance. One of Trent's men spotted them and raised his rifle, but Gareth didn't even break stride. He fired on the run, the heavy, .45 caliber bullet catching the outlaw in the chest and spinning him into the dirt. Claire threw herself onto the burning porch, ignoring the searing heat. She kicked the front door open and plunged into the smoke-filled parlor. The fire had taken hold of the walls, the roar of the flames deafening. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling beneath the thickest layer of smoke, her eyes stinging and watering, desperately searching for the heavy oak trapdoor. She found it, the broken padlock still laying where Gareth had snapped it days ago. She threw the door open and scrambled down the wooden stairs into the damp, awful darkness she knew so well. Above her, heavy boots thumped against the floorboards. Josiah Trent stepped into the parlor, his face blackened with soot, a cruel, triumphant sneer twisting his lips. He saw the open trap door. "Going back to your cage, little bird?" Trent mocked, raising his revolver. Suddenly, a massive figure materialized from the smoke. Gareth slammed into Trent with the force of a runaway locomotive. Both men crashed through the weakened floorboards, plunging down into the cellar just as Claire reached the dirt floor. The 2 men hit the stone ground with a bone-jarring impact. Trent's gun went flying into the darkness. Gareth was instantly on top of him, his massive fists coming down like hammers. But Trent was a seasoned killer. He drew a long, serrated hunting knife from his boot and drove it upward. Gareth twisted, but the blade caught him in the ribs, slicing through his coat and tearing into his flesh. Gareth grunted in pain, rolling off the outlaw. Trent scrambled to his feet, lunging forward to finish the job. Josiah! Trent froze, turning toward the voice. Claire was standing in the shadows of her former prison. In her left hand she held a rolled, yellowed parchment, the master deed she had just pulled from the hollow stone. In her right hand she held the silver derringer, aimed squarely at the center of Trent's chest. "You're trespassing on my property," Claire said coldly. She fired. The bullet struck Trent in the shoulder, dropping him to his knees. Before he could recover, Gareth rose up behind him and delivered a crushing blow to the back of the outlaw's skull with the heavy brass handle of his own hunting knife. Trent collapsed face first into the dirt, unconscious. The ceiling above them groaned menacingly. Glowing embers began to rain down through the shattered floorboards. "We need to move!" Gareth shouted over the roaring inferno. He grabbed Trent by his coat collar, unwilling to let the man burn to death, and dragged the heavy outlaw up the stairs. Claire followed close behind, clutching the deed to her chest. They burst out of the burning house, coughing violently, collapsing into the cool evening grass, just as the roof of the Trent farmhouse caved in with a spectacular shower of sparks. As they lay there, gasping for fresh air, the rhythmic pounding of dozens of horses approached from the main road. Gareth weakly raised his revolver, preparing for the rest of the Red River boys. Instead, emerging from the twilight, rode a posse of well-armed lawmen. At their head was a man wearing the unmistakable badge of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Agent Thomas Wade rode forward, looking at the burning wreckage, the unconscious outlaw, and the bleeding mountain man lying next to the heiress. "Miss Abernathy, I presume?" Agent Wade said, tipping his hat. "Your telegram to the Chicago office took some time to reach Judge Isaac Parker's jurisdiction, but we tracked Mercer's fraudulent bank transfers. Looks like you've handled the rough work yourself." Claire looked at the Pinkerton agent, then down at the master deed in her hands. She had won. Her father's legacy was safe. Caleb Mercer would be exposed, and Josiah Trent would hang. She was incredibly wealthy once again, free to return to the high society of Denver or San Francisco. She turned her gaze to Gareth. He was sitting up, clutching his bleeding side, watching her with a quiet, solemn resignation, expecting her to walk away into her reclaimed life. Claire knelt beside the bruised and bleeding mountain man. She reached out, her delicate fingers gently tracing the uninjured side of his bearded face. "Agent Wade," Claire said, without looking away from Gareth's dark, rugged eyes. "Take Trent and Mercer to the authorities. The Abernathy estate will compensate your agency handsomely." "And where will you be, Miss Abernathy?" Wade asked. Claire smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that chased away the lingering shadows of the cellar. She leaned in, resting her forehead against Gareth's. "I'm going home, up on Timber Ridge." Thank you for listening to this thrilling frontier tale of survival and Wild West romance. If Gareth and Claire's harrowing journey captured your heart, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow storytelling fans, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, gritty historical dramas. Don't forget to ring the bell for notifications and drop a comment below on what you thought of Josiah's ultimate fate.